So, to review 310, these are two separate things. They live in the same apartment complex. The elbow joint capsule has the same water balloon for both of them, but they are two separate joints. The elbow, and what's extra confusing is that both of them are uniaxial joints, but what makes them different is the axis itself. The elbow is a hinge joint, so there's going to be general motion involved, in other words, rotation and translation of the distal segment. The radial, that's the elbow. The radial ulnar joint is what we call a pivot joint or a trochoid joint, where the axis is polar and there's more pure rotation involved in this kind of stuff. Okay, so two separate things. And to make things even worse, or easier, depending on how much you study, is that we're going to put both joints on one circle. And we're going to do that because we don't want to be too redundant. What I mean is that you're going to have a lot of muscles that function at both joints. So instead of doing two separate joints and having the same muscles, we're just going to combine them because they each use a different axis. I think it'd be different if one used two and the other just used one, but they're two separate axes. So it works. So your elbow, you see on the little key at the top right? So flexion, extension happens at the elbow joint, bilateral axis. We're going to have muscles that pull in the direction of flexion or muscles that pull in the direction of extension. Those are going to be our flexors and extensors. So it's important to know that sitting in the front or back of class, sitting anterior, crossing anterior, posterior, only affects the elbow joint in this classroom. There is no lateral or medial in terms of function because your elbow doesn't move in the front plane. I'm not saying you don't have muscles that sit in the inside or outside, but it doesn't matter because your elbow doesn't move that way. Okay? Now, the NA, AP, that's what I'm basically it's another way to say the same thing. The anterior posterior axis doesn't matter. Now, it matters for injury biomechanics. I land on my arm and I have valgus stress or varistress and I sprain ligaments. Frontal plane means something, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of active motion where muscles are responsible for your motion, okay? So that's what I mean by that. And then the polar axis, that's the radial ulnar joint, the RU joint, and that's going to involve pronation and supination. Remember wrapping, unwrapping, going prone, going supine. Remember how in 310, I don't care for the soup bowl thing because what soup bowl gives you is a global reference. Well, when my hand is facing the ceiling, it's this. When my hand's not. And then remember in class, I gave you an example where your hand can face the ceiling and you still have pronation. So it's the concept of going prone or going supine, where in anatomical position, your radius is supine, and if it rolls into a prone position, that's pronation. And if it unwraps or unrolls back into the so it's more about being prone or supine relative to those bones than a global reference, okay? So our rotation arrows, remember for the wrist we didn't have any rotation arrows, right? Because the wrist doesn't twist. But the radial ulnar joint twists, so we have rotation arrows. And all of those rotation arrows only deal with muscles that influence the radial ulnar joint. Pronators or supinators, wrappers or unwrappers. Okay? And you're going to have some muscles who are elbow flexors and radial ulnar joint pronators. Separate functions at separate joints because they cross both joints. Okay? All right? So I wanted to break down the structure of the class, and then obviously we're going to get into specific muscles after we kind of introduce you to the structure. So for the purposes of this class, I want to remind you that my goal is to get you to remember some of this stuff. What do I mean by that? That you can be like my sons, right? Casual Saints fans. And they know Drew Brees, but I'm like a freak. I know like the third string tight end, and I know more of the team, but we watch the games we play. My point is that I'd rather you recall the stud function muscles than to have overload you with secondary, tertiary, So I'm not disrespecting those secondary, tertiary. I'm just saying, look, you may become a bigger fan of this down the road, and you're going to learn the third string tight end and who can help a little bit more. I just want you to know these prime movers, these major muscles, because to me, that has a better chance of you carrying those on and learning, okay? So it's no disrespect to some of those secondary and tertiaries, but I just want you to at least remember the supercell. All right? So anterior crossing muscles, those are going to be our elbow flexors. Posterior crossing muscles, our elbow extensors. Remember, this is anatomical position, right? So in anatomical position, we are in a supinated position. So in anatomical, you're going to have certain muscles that are trying to wrap you. You have other muscles that are trying to unwrap you. There is one curveball that I want to talk about now before we get into it, and that is, as a dyslexic, I randomly capitalize stuff. It drives my wife crazy. I just can't help it. Like, just random letters, just capitalize. And sometimes it's just hard for me to decide. So sometimes I do it one way, sometimes I do it the other way. But each have valid points. What I mean by that is, how do you draw function of a muscle that neither has anterior or posterior crossings, but only has radial ulnar joint rotational function? And I told you last class, if you don't want to have function, it sits the fence, it's on an axis. Well, if it has no function on either axis, it has to sit on both axes. It literally has to sit in the middle of the circle to neither be anterior, posterior, be overlap. So what I did in this circle is, it's like having a clear bowl, where the bowl is sitting on both fences. So you see these three muscles in the middle, pro Q, pro T, and what's up? It's like sitting in a glass bowl where the bowl itself is on the bilateral and AP axis, neither front, back, left, right. But you can see through it to see that those axes are there. Because I could have eliminated it and just had an empty circle, but I wanted to remind you that the axis didn't disappear, it's still there. But those three muscles sit both the AP and bilateral axis. They don't have any sagittal function, they just have transverse function. Okay. So that can be a little confusing, because unless I teach you that, then you're like, oh, the pro T is anterior, or the what's up muscle is in the back and this in the front. No, that's on a bowl, and that bowl is on both fences, and they're neither front, back, left, right. They just spin. Okay? They're just spinners. All right. If you guys miss the what's up muscle, but I don't think y'all are going to do that. Oh, wait. First muscle I'm going to talk about. So, as part of this, oh man, this was about 5 years ago. So, as you can tell, I'm not very good with tech. I'm old school chalk teach, but I had a student that came to me to do a senior project, and we had to come up with a project. And I said, in school, these used to be transparencies. I don't know if y'all know what that is. They're like transparencies, and you put it on the board and it would project. And I said, what would be cool is if we got, because that might have been like the last transparency machine in existence, right? I mean, they don't really make these anymore. And I was like, what would be cool is if we had these pictures that I'm using in class, digital, so they post them on Google. So her job was to get those transparencies onto these PDFs. This is a great lesson, such a great lesson about function. So one of the muscles she included in the wrist lecture is a wrist muscle. And it's understandable why she would put it as an accident, because look how close it lives to the wrist. Okay? So one of your radial ulnar joint muscles, that's why I'm leading off with this, is on your wrist circles, but it has nothing to do with the wrist. My athletic trainers can relate to this, and not just them. Maybe some of you guys have had some experience with spine boarding, right, people? When you spine board, you kind of have to have, you don't just have one person rolling, you kind of have someone at the head and someone at the feet, right? You kind of want to distribute the rotation equally, right? It's the same thing with our radial ulnar joint. And the analogies are so consistent. Pronating, supinating, rolling, unrolling, unwrapping, unwrapping. So it makes sense that if we're going to unwrap or wrap something, we kind of want to be in different parts of the person that we're wrapping or unwrapping. So this muscle called the pronator quadratus, a muscle that pulls in the direction of pronation. It's kind of a square shape, but it's distal. It's like in the feet. It's like trying to wrap distally at the feet part. You got some wrappers up here, you got some wrappers there, you got wrapper, not like wrappers like M&M last time, but just you have muscles that are trying to pull in the direction of wrapping and unwrapping. So pronator quadratus. It's a muscle that goes from ulna to radius, distal. Remember, radius moves ulna doesn't, right? So it's anchored, it's fixed on the ulna, and it's literally trying to wrap the radius or about itself. Okay? Pronator quadratus. How do we know where's the radius, man? Thumb and pinky always. Thumb and pinky. Radius is going to be thumb side. Ulna is going to be pinky side. So that muscle is anchored on that ulna, and it's literally like pulling the radius to wrap itself over. Okay? A square-shaped pronator muscle. So again, I wanted to lead off with that one because it's in your wrist slides, but it shouldn't be. It should be in the radial ulnar joint slides. So where would a all-the-time pronator muscle live in our circle? I would struggle with this. Where's my circle? Did I fix that up? Not good. So where does so pronator quadratus, pro-Q, and again, in anatomical position, this is a right. Remember, all of our appendicular circles are going to be rights. So in anatomical position, that muscle is trying to wrap. It's trying to pull in the direction of radial ulnar joint pronation. Does that make sense? Can it be responsible for supination? Sure, while still pulling in the direction of pronation, while working eccentrically. Again, it's just common verbiage. That pronator on the way it's written, because again, guys, think about the just what that would mean. Pronator quadratus. Anytime you see pronation, that muscle is working? Of course not. You could have pronation because of supinators, right? So that can't be worded because of motion. I'm going to beat this dead horse every time some of you are sick of it. I don't care. This cannot be worded because of motion. It has to be worded because of direction of pull. The way it pulls, not the way it moves. Pronator quadratus, a square-shaped muscle that pulls in the direction of pronation at the distal radial ulnar joint. All right. Moving on. Let's look at another muscle you should not miss. The what's up muscle. Guys, there's a muscle called the supinator. And if you miss it, shaminator. Now, what's going to make you miss it? What's going to make you miss it is one of your 3 Ten Commandments. We don't associate muscles with motion. So the temptation is that the supinator muscle is involved in supination. That's the temptation. The books, or some of the textbooks that are written by people that don't understand specific biomechanics of how this stuff works, they may say the function of the supinator muscle is supination. And all I'm asking you to add in there is the function of the supinator muscle is supination pull. Pulling in the direction of supination. Not necessarily causing it. I could have supination with no muscles involved. I could have supination because of pronators. I can, isometrics, I don't even have motion, but yet I could be using this muscle, right, to prevent something. It has nothing to do with literal motion. It has everything to do with the direction of pull of a motion. Just cannot emphasize that enough. So again, if you study from textbooks, all I'm trying to do is just clear the water. Supinator its function is supination. It's a supination puller. Pulls in the direction of supination. I think in class I used an example of, like, if you had a dumbbell and isometric work, right? So I'm not moving. So if all you say is bicep is its function is flexion, and you don't see flexion, then do we say it's not working? Okay? So just again, guys, to reiterate, pulls in direction. So shut up, Campbell, how does it work? All right, here's how it works. We're going ulna, right? So lateral ulna. And you can actually look at the origins of this thing. There's like technical little sulcums and little terms. But the bottom line is it's on this bone, and it's going to that bone. It crosses to get to that bone, and it pulls this way. Like, function doesn't have to be complicated. If I have a string that goes from this bone to that bone, guess what? It's going to pull this way. And it doesn't have to be complex. Ulna. Now, we know that the ulna doesn't rotate the transverse plane, right? Ulna's not going that. It's a great way to anchor and attach to something that does rotate the transverse plane. So watch. This is how it works. Unwrap. We had one in the front that wraps, pulls in the direction of wrapping. The opposite cross is going to be an unwrapper. That's how it works. It goes proximal, the top part, lateral ulna, to my radius, and it pulls laterally. Almost so you can imagine like an external rotator. Pulling laterally. It's pulling laterally to unwrap the supinator. Can the supinator be responsible for the motion of pronation? Absolutely. But only through eccentric work. Absolutely. Can the supinator be working and you not have any motion at all? Absolutely. But it would have to be working to prevent something that's trying to pronate you, right? In other words, if I had a hammer and I held that hammer like this, you can imagine gravity's trying to pronate me, right? So my supinator could be working isometrically, preventing motion. But guess what? It's still a supinator. And its function doesn't change. It's still pulling in the direction of supination, preventing gravity from pronating. Tricep and supinator. The way I like to imagine this muscle got its name is that they had a conference to name muscles, and it was late, and they were tired, and they were hungry, and they were just like, what do we call this one? Supinator. Good idea. Done. What does it do? It pulls in the direction of supination. Let's call it the supinator. This meeting is adjourned. So let's take a look at it in a circle. I try to, when I can, put muscles locally referenced, in other words, kind of where they are in the body. So this is kind of a lateral crossing muscle, pulls in the direction of supination. Okay? And you may say, well, what about an anatomical position? Well, an anatomical position, it still pulls that way. It's just that you run out of road. You get an end point there, bone smacking up against bone in this case. But yet it still could, if your body allowed more, it could it could pull it more. But you just run out of road. Okay, so we got pro Q, we got the sub. Now we need the pro T. Sounds like I'm selling supplements. Pro T. What's protein? Pronator teres. Pronator teres. That'd be a cool, I don't know why, what the Latin term for teres is. I don't even know if the dude name was Terry. I don't know. Pronator teres. We got a few teres. We got a teres ligament and pronator teres. So there must be something there. That'd be a good research question. So here's how the pronator teres works. First of all, it's a wrapper. It's a muscle that's pulling to wrap the radius around the elbow. Okay, starts on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, right? So the inside part, those knobs. Dude, those knobs serve as great anchorage for muscles, right? We're mechanically advantaged, kind of getting out there and kind of knobbing it out, get some extra surface area. And so if the quadratus kind of has the feet, pronator teres kind of has the body, right in the middle, pulling on the body. Let me extract that darn brachioradialis out the way and see if we can see exactly where in the middle the pronator teres is yanking. And I'll show you on the bone itself too. Okay, check this out. Pronator teres. Okay? So it's a wrapper, right? I'm trying to wrap. Pronator teres. Pronator teres. Now, the pronator teres does have because some of you may be like, well, dude, that's kind of crossing in the front. And it's like, yeah, you're right. It does have a elbow flexion component. It's just not one of the big players. It's not one of the major ones. So that's why I'm not holding you accountable for it. I'm just holding you accountable for the big players. So, dude, this drives me bonkers. There we go. So all of your specialists, I call them specialists, but in basketball, you have players whose only job is to shoot threes. Sharpshooters, very specialized function. I guess in baseball we could talk about closers or heck, pinch hitters. I mean, sometimes you have like lefty relievers whose only job is to hit a left-handed out. Okay? That's kind of how I view these sharpshooter, pronator, and supinators. Like their job is just to pull, to wrap or unwrap, pull in the direction of wrap, pull in the direction of unwrap. Okay? So pronator teres, pronator quadratus, and the supinator, they're only radial joint functioning muscles for the purpose of this class. Pull in direction of pronation, supinator, pull in direction of supination. You do have a couple major elbow flexors who are also pronator supinators, and those are going to be the ones I'm going to talk about next. Let's see. All right, so the next muscle I'm going to talk about is this bad boy. The biceps brachii. So bicycle, two wheels, biceps. Sep is like Latin for like head, cephalic, cephala. You know, you got some cepha stuff in your brain, right? So a two-headed muscle. And then you kind of have this area of the arm that we're familiar with, brachial part of the arm, right? Brachial pulse, brachial artery, just kind of this midway area of the arm. So biceps brachii is a two-headed muscle that kind of runs along the brachial part. But, you know. Shoulder function, then it gets a little freaky. We're going to talk about that when I lecture about the shoulder. But the elbow function, there's an easy one and a tough one. First of all, let's kind of ignore, you have fascia all over the body. And for the longest time, we didn't know what fascia did. We just thought it was kind of shrink wrap. But that fascia has a lot of proprioceptive properties, places in space, giving feedback about motion and how far out. So I don't want you to confuse this as the actual rope that the muscle's pulling on. That's just some lateral fascia that kind of fans out so that we can get some better sensory processing information on the elbow. Okay? The rope is here. That's where the rope is at. And we can tell by the roundness of this that this is the radius, right? So right away, because that muscle's pulling on the radius, and we know the radius can wrap and unwrap, it has the potential to be a radial ulnar joint functioning muscle. Okay? So the elbow function, pretty simple, right? Crossing anterior is going to be a big player in terms of being an elbow focus. The radial ulnar joint function is the freaky one. Okay? So we have this little styloid, this little bump on the inside of our radius. And see that little drip, that little dot right there? So that's where the biceps brachii attaches. Now watch what happens when I pronate. It goes from being in the front to face down, right? So what happens is that this muscle, the string, because it gets longer when I pronate, if you can imagine this muscle pulling like this, wouldn't it pull to unwrap the radius above the ulna? In other words, when I pronate, I make it longer, and when I supinate, I make it shorter. And that's what happens here. So this is in kind of anatomical position. What you have to imagine is that if that muscle inserts here, when I do this, I'm actually twirling it. Ooh, Lord. I'm not doing it. You gotta imagine this, guys. You gotta imagine this. If that muscle inserts here, when I pronate, I'm literally wrapping that bicep. I'm spiraling it around the radius. And when it pulls, it wants to unwrap. Now, just like when you were a kid, you spiral something around a bat, and then you pull it in the bat, that'll whip around, roll around. That's what's happening here. Here's another cool way to see what I'm talking about. If you flex your elbow, and you take your palm and you just put it on the meaty part of your bicep. Some biceps are more meatier than others. I feel my humerus. That's how unmeaty my bicep is. And then pronate and supinate. And you're going to feel that muscle shorten and lengthen. You're going to feel it. You feel it shorten and lengthen. And when it lengthens, you pronate. And when you supinate, it shortens. Because when you pronate, it's literally being wrapped around the radial head. That's not the radial head, but close enough. And when you supinate, it's unwrapping. So mechanically, guys, this is how it works. I'm pulling on my bicep string, bang, 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 bang. Elbow flexor, radial ulnar joint, supinate. Elbow flexor, radial ulnar joint, supinated. Why? Because it pulls on the radius in such a way that when you pronate, you wrap it around the inside part of that radius. And so when you supinate, you spit it out, you unwrap it. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool. What I'm going to lecture on Wednesday is the whys of different radial ulnar joint positions to emphasize certain muscles. I'm going to teach you concepts of insufficiency, where that's going to be Wednesday. That's kind of cool. So we're going to get to the two-headed sections when we lecture on the shoulder, but the key thing is that both of those heads blend in into one rope as it crosses the elbow and the radial ulnar joint.
Would you say they originate in two different places or insert in two different places?
potato, super honestly, because of the nature of human movement being biomechanically different. So in other words, we know that door, and that's a great question, we know that door is always going to move about the wall. But in biomechanics, sometimes I'm moving this part, but sometimes I'm moving that part. Sometimes I'm doing hamstrings curls, but sometimes I'm doing glute ham raises. So who's the origin and who's the insertion, right? So most of the time, though, we default to proximal to distal, but honest to goodness, the reality is sometimes my insertions are origins, sometimes my origins are insertions. So at the end of the day, it still just comes down to function. So that's a great question. What I mean by that is if you're doing pull-ups, then who's fixed and who's moving, right? You know, versus a lat pull down. So it does kind of become semantical. Typically, what they'll default to is that the origins are the closer ones to the thorax and the insertions are the distal ones to the thorax. But in terms of practice, you can make an insertion become an origin. I think the best example of that is the hamstring curls versus the glute ham raise, where, you know, traditionally you have the legs do this, but for a glute hamstring, you gotta do this, right? Where now your insertion is the origin, and it's on the other side. So that's a fun conversation. So what we're going to do is we're going to default to tradition. Tradition is proximal to distal. They originate, and this is for the shoulder flexor, but you see this little coracoid process. Your short head is here, and your long head is this little red dot, supraclavian fossa right there. So they originate here, they run down, blend into one solid rope, and then insert on that radial side. But my point is that even though you see two separate strings up here, there's one big string down there. Right? And so semantically, when we get into the shoulder, there's going to be one little different, like, hey, the short head does this and the long head does that. But in terms of the elbow, they both do the same thing because they're pulling on the same rope. Okay? So in other words, we don't have to be redundant. We don't have to say biceps, brachii, long head, and short head. That's like if you have, does anybody here have a twin? Anybody have a twin? You have a twin? So let's say you and your twin, boy, girl, who's older? So let's say y'all did something together. Well, we don't have to, what's his name? Taylor? So we don't have to be redundant and say the twins, Emily and Taylor, did, right? Now, if you did something separately, then we say what you did. But if you did something together, we don't have to be redundant. We don't have to say the twins and then say who's in setback. So it's very similar. Knowing that Emily and Taylor function the same down here, we just have to say biceps brachii. But then when we get into the shoulder, and you guys have different interests, different functions, then we may say, hey, the long head does this, and the short head does that. So that's how we differentiate the semantics of that. But at the elbow, y'all are doing the same thing. So we don't have to be redundant there. Okay? Good stuff, guys. Thank you for that question. Anytime y'all have questions, too. And listen, I don't know a lot of stuff, but if I don't know or if I don't have to look it up, I'll find it for you and report back to you. Oh, guys, another thing I want to point out mechanically is, and I know I've said it before, but I'm going to try to regurgitate it as many times as possible, is muscles don't just move us, they stabilize us, right? So you just imagine holding something heavy in your arms. That's traction. That's something trying to pull this out. That's something trying to pull your elbow apart. That's something to try to pull your shoulder apart. So look at the stability that a powerful muscle like this would have when you're holding on to something heavy, preventing the elbow, also pulling at the shoulder, right? Preventing your shoulder from coming out of place, your elbow from coming out of place. So just that secondary stabilizing function, sometimes we just need to appreciate it and see these muscles kind of working as splinters, not like the kind you get in your finger, but their function of just keeping a rigid link while we're carrying heavy things to prevent translation joints in a straight line fashion. Okay, so to review what we got so far. Function of the pronator quadratus, radial ulnar joint pronator. It's called the pronator quadratus. You shouldn't miss it. Function of the pronator teres, radial ulnar joint pronator. Function of the supinator, radial ulnar joint supinator, right? Function of the biceps brachii. Well, it functions at two different joints, right? Elbow flexor, radial ulnar joint supinator. Okay? So the verbiage is usually when we have a muscle that functions at multiple joints, sometimes it's common to say it's biarticular or biaxial, and that's kind of subjective, meaning that the elbow has a different axis than the radial ulnar joint. So it functions at two joints. That's just another way of saying that. Biceps brachii functions at the shoulder, functions at the elbow, functions at the radial, functioning at three separate articulations, joints. So you may have heard that term before, biarticular, biaxial. I love that word, fibrous lacertus. It sounds like a Harry Potter spell, right? Fibrous lacertus. And then it takes the cadaver and preps the cadaver. All right, I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about pulleys today. Remember how I said I'm going to try to throw in some biomechanical terms with stuff that we're familiar with, right? So there's a lot of different kind of pulleys, but one of the ways pulleys just help serve mechanical advantages, whether it's change direction sometimes or increase an angle of pull. You guys are familiar with how the patella could be served as a pulley to help, the mechanical advantage of our quad. But another way we can have pulleys in our body is through muscles, where one muscle that's deep can serve as a piggyback for another muscle on top of it to increase its angle of pull. So the brachialis is one of these kind of pulley type muscles. The brachialis is a certified BA. He's bad, dude. Doesn't get a lot of love. Why do you think the brachialis doesn't get a lot of love? It's deep. It's true, right? Out of sight, out of mind. Absolutely. It's deep, so you don't see it. The biceps brachii is the one everybody loves. That's the one everybody talks about because it's superficial. I don't mean like the biceps brachii has an attitude, but just it's the one everybody sees. Okay? But the biceps brachii owes a lot of its mechanical advantage to the grunt underneath it doing some of the dirty work. And you have these pulleys all over the place. In the leg, you guys have heard the term like gastroc and the soleus. Y'all heard that term before, right? Well, it's kind of a piggyback muscle. Soleus doesn't get the love because it's deep, and the gastroc is the piggyback on top of it. You have these all over the body, okay? But the brachialis is a beast of an elbow flexor. Some consider it the prime mover of the elbow. Now, one of the things the brachialis can't, one of its advantages is that it doesn't have to stress or worry about radial ulnar joint function. But bless you. What I mean by that is, has anybody ever heard the term too many fires in the kitchen? Meaning that if you're trying to multitask, you're more likely to make a mistake, right? You're more likely to, oops, I forgot this too long. Right? Brachialis is like, it's just making mac and cheese, bro. Its job is to make toast, and it does a good job of it. Meaning that because it crosses the elbow in front, brachialis starts around the brachial part of the arm, brachial pulse, brachial, that kind of stuff, comes down and pulls on the ulna. It doesn't have to worry about this secondary function, whether you want to cause it, not cause it, keep the radial. Biceps brachii has a lot to worry about. The biceps brachii is getting communication from shoulder, from elbow, from radial ulna. We need you to pull, but not too much because we don't want to have this secondary front. There's a lot of stuff. And what we learn from injury research is that most of the time, majority of the time, when you have strains, sprains, injuries, there's miscommunication. So something should have turned on that didn't. Or something that should have turned on didn't, or something that didn't turn on should have. And then all of a sudden, there's more stress being taken on in other muscles at times. Okay? So my point is that a muscle like the bicep tends to get hurt a lot because it has a lot of stuff going on. It has to get signals to do this, but don't do that. And there's a lot of stuff, and the more stuff you do, the more likely you're going to make a mistake. Brachialis don't care. Brachialis has like one big time function, and that's to be an elbow flexor. Don't worry, it doesn't care about the shoulder, doesn't care about the radial joint. It is just a beast of an elbow flexor. And it's been conditioned because it doesn't have those extra advantages the bicep has by being able to piggyback on top of it. Brachialis, like, I don't need no piggyback, I don't need no pulley, I got this all myself. So it's kind of transitioned to have to be a very forcefully innervated elbow flexor because it doesn't have any of these extra mechanical advantages that other muscles have. Absolute beast. Thank you, brachialis. Thank you for all that you do for us. So let's see where we are. Biceps brachii, elbow flexor supinator. Brachialis, elbow flexor. Pronator quadratus, pronator teres, supinator. Let's knock out this tricep and anconeus before I get into the hardest muscle, and that's the brachioradialis. The B-rad. Okay. All right, so bicep, 2, tricep, 3, a 3-headed muscle along the brachial part of the arm. You have a medial and a lateral head, and then you have this long head. Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. We're going to see that commonly in the body, where I'll give you an example. The quad, you have one muscle that crosses into your hip, the other 3 don't. So their wordings is vastus medialis, lateralis, intermedius, rectus, femoris. Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. So in other words, the muscle, the head that goes and does something else has this much different name. Adductors is the same. You have like the longus, brevis, magnus, gracilis. The one that crosses into the knee has a much different name. So the tricep, you have a medial, more on the inside, lateral, outside. Then you have this long head that goes off and functions at the shoulder. Again, why does it function at the shoulder? Typically, we just think about motion, but in terms of being a splint, again, to help prevent the humerus from literally being pulled out when you're holding on to heavy things. And guys, think about that for a second. Some of these heavy lifters, the amount of weight they lifted up, and all that stuff is traction and trying to pull their humerus outside. You better have some mechanisms in place to prevent that translation. Okay? However, at the elbow, pretty straightforward. This is your upper extremities quad. Just like you have your quad doing this, you got your tricep, and you have one other muscle called the anconeus that kind of functions as that 4th elbow extensor, crossing the elbow posteriorly. Now, mechanically, you get a different type of pulley. It's kind of more similar to the patella. That olecranon process, right guys, this right here, that's a patella. It hasn't been evolved. In other words, for the knee, I had to break it off of my tibia so that I could rotate my knee to cut and plant. This is your upper extremities version of the patella. What a great mechanical advantage to be able to pull on this extra bony notch to pull in the direction of extension. So, in other words, if you look at the picture, you're like, well, how does that cross the elbow? I mean, it's still kind of on the humerus. Well, that is a new bone. That's ulna. It's a peninsula of the ulna. So that's how it crosses the elbow, because it's pulling on a bone distal to it. Okay? So that could be sometimes an illusion where you don't physically see the muscle crossing. but it's crossing because it's pulling on the next bone down. Okay? Yeah, man, that is your elbow patella. That's really cool. If you look at x-rays, like it looks just like a knee, kind of knee. Elbow to knee. So triceps brachii. Why don't we need to be redundant? Because medial, lateral, long all have the same function at the elbow, so we don't have to go redundant. We don't have to say triceps brachii, medial, lateral, long. If they all have the same function, then saying triceps brachii infers all three heads. And then when we get into the elbow, then we're going to say, no, just this one does this. That's when we're going to discuss them independently. All right, the last elbow extensor, your fourth. Let's see, your fourth. I like to look at it as your quad. It's your anconeus. Think of your anconeus as they kind of crisscross. It crisscross applesauces with the supinator, but the supinator goes from humerus to radius, right, to unwrap. This one starts on the lateral part of your humerus and it goes to the ulna, so there's no rotation involved, right? Because the ulna doesn't rotate. Yeah? So in terms of stabilizer, that kind of makes sense because a lot of times when your elbow is extended, all those muscles can really work to stay. But a problem becomes when we flex. Because when we flex, all of this pull-up doesn't help us in the across. An example of that is, John, put your hands together. Remember the old, don't let me knock your hands off, right? And the reason we always have the advantage is because John's producing force this way, I'm producing force perpendicular. You know, I couldn't do this to you. So it's very similar when our elbows are extended, we have these big powerful muscles preventing excessive translation. But when we're flexed, all of that pull up doesn't necessarily help us in the across. So that's where a muscle kind of like the anconeus kind of gives us some extra stability in the across when we sometimes have forces that are trying to translate our bones and our big powerful muscles aren't in a position to maintain that stability. In terms of motion though, because it crosses posteriorly, it's pulling on the ulna to move it about the humerus, so it's going to be an elbow extensor. Okay. Once again, why doesn't it have radial ulnar joint function? Because it doesn't pull on the radius. It's as easy as that. Muscles that pull on the radius have the potential to wrap and unwrap. Muscles that pull on the ulna, Okay, so next class, I'm going to lecture about the brachioradialis. Just a heads up, the brachioradialis is freaky. It's one of our midway muscles. It's like the rectus, where in certain positions, it's going to want to pull us back to midway. I'm going to lecture about that all on Wednesday. Okay? Y'all have a good day.